Even before we left Holland, there were rumours by word of mouth that we were to be sent home. We willingly believed these rumours. They coincided with our desire and were in keeping with our notion that there could be no new theatre of war. None of us realised how alarmed the foreign information services were at the news of the troop movements. When the order finally came to load into the railway train, we were all of one mind that we would unload in Schwerin in 2 days. We travelled through Holland and the soldiers sang songs. We passed through German towns, and as the train slowed down, passing the railway stations, people nodded and shouted at us. Joking cheers were heard here and there. At last we were home. In France and Holland no one greeted us, none of us listened to the cheers. Their people looked at us sternly or turned away. With singing cheers, cheered by the population, we rolled towards Berlin. Echelon after echelon, battalion after battalion, regiment after regiment, division after division. But we should have turned north soon, if we were going to get to Schwerin one way or another. We could have turned aside much earlier, near Hamburg or at the very least at Magdeburg. But we travelled as far as Berlin, stocked up on water and coal, and moved on as far as Kustrin. There the camp kitchens distributed hot food. Then the journey continued, but not to Schwerin, still further east. We rode all day. We rode all night through occupied Poland, where sentries patrolled along the railway lines, and it was conspicuous that they were very numerous, although our newspapers claimed that the Poles were more than happy with the establishment of the new order. We rolled further and further eastwards, and the boys stopped singing. At last our journey ended somewhere south of Königsberg, at one of the unloading stations without a name, specially built for military purposes, far away from any habitation. Had it not been for the loud orders of the officers and the shouts of the non-commissioned officers who were giving instructions to the manoeuvring locomotives, we would have noticed that there was an oppressive silence. No one uttered a single superfluous word. Only the essentials were spoken. The disappointment was too great. After all, most of our soldiers came from Mecklenburg, and all of them had expected to be discharged on Sunday afternoon. Meanwhile, we were in East Prussia and did not know what awaited us next. We were quartered in a village near the Soviet border, and the usual exercises began. The staff offices worked as they had in the past when garrisoned and as they did later in France and Holland. The telephones rang. We travelled to regimental or divisional headquarters for the usual meetings. The general commanding it supposedly knew nothing more than what we knew. We were transferred to East Prussia. We were to serve and wait for orders. But some of us had acquaintances in the Corps headquarters and heard something there. At any rate, every 3 days we learnt something reliable. It was impossible to just keep everything secret. No, it was not tough, because it became obvious. For one reason or another, the Operation Sea Lion sailed. Rommel took in Africa initial positions for the campaign to the Suez Canal. From Greece, the British kicked out of the British, and our parachute landings were just busy to recapture Crete. Consequently, it was now necessary to bypass the British from the rear, take away their oil in the Middle East and seize their positions there. Well-versed people even claimed that the Führer had conceived a campaign to India. The Soviet Union, bound to us by a non-aggression pact, as if already expressed willingness to allow the passage of German troops through its territory. Somewhat later, when the concentration and echeloning of our formations gradually began to resemble the occupation of initial positions, to us from the cauldrons of the rumour mill leaked a second version of the meaning of our movements. It was whispered that it was intended to divert the attention of the British and thus put their vigilance to sleep. On a clear summer day with calm seas, the actions of our navy crossing the Channel, and in addition parachute landings, will take the British by surprise. The better we manage to create the impression that we are preparing something against the Russians, the more soundly the British will sleep. But the rumour mill began to spread a third version. There was talk of huge movements of the Red Army, as if directed against us. We assumed that Berlin and Moscow agreed on this to finally screw the British. Version about the deployment of Soviet divisions near our border was spreading more and more persistently, and finally was officially announced. However, it was a Russian manoeuvres. Now we did not know what to think at all. At this stage all rumours gradually ceased, and we gave ourselves up to thoughtless waiting. The desire for peace was combined with the notion that there, upstairs, we'll cope with the situation. Fourier, give the order. We'll follow you. The order put an end to all rumours. The most insane and at the same time the most despicable order that history has ever known. But unfortunately, we didn't think so at the time. The Führer ordered, and we said that's right, But we did not say it as vigorously as before, probably because everyone had heard something about Napoleon at school. At the beginning of the summer of 1941, Saturday started as usual. Before lunch, we had light drills and weapons inspection. After lunch, we organized a platoon competition in singing songs. The distinguished platoon received a barrel of beer. For some time, however, new preparations had been taking place unnoticed by the rank and file. Officers' reconnaissance teams surveyed the border and scouted the roads. For this purpose, we drove up to the border in the hours of evening twilight to the limits of visibility and hearing, and then crept further on foot. We could see the Soviet border posts on watchtowers and hear them talking to each other as they changed guard. They used the narrow path and rarely cast a glance in our direction. We scouted for a week, mapped our findings and reported them to the authorities. Nothing else happened. We didn't know that all the schools and dance halls in our rear were already occupied as medical centres. If we had known, we would have welcomed these prudent measures. In the evening, the company commanders were ordered to report to the regimental headquarters. We arrived almost simultaneously and asked each other what this could mean. Meetings with the regimental commander always took place in the afternoon, during normal business hours. In the evening, invitations to feasts were sent. The commander waited for us with a serious expression on his face. He spoke more quietly than usual, as if he feared not to be overheard by the Soviet border guards who were a kilometre away from us. Each company commander was handed a large brown envelope with instructions to open it only at his command post, and in no case to open it before midnight. Orders were given to immediately put units on alert and pull up to the frontier starting lines. We returned to our companies, sounded the alarm and moved to the initial lines, car by car, with lights out. The soldiers even now had reason to believe that a drill was going on. They got off their vehicles, wrapped themselves in macintoshes, and soon fell asleep on the ground in the woods, swearing thoroughly about the Saturday alert and the pesky East Prussian mosquitoes. My liaison called all the platoon commanders together. I again ordered a report on the status of the platoons and the events of the alert. We filled silver glasses engraved with the date, given by the regimental commander to officers for their birthday, and drank French brandy. Smoking British trophy tobacco navy cut, we tried to protect ourselves from the buzzing mosquitoes. Soldiers snored around us. It smelled of earth, leather, and petrol. Just before midnight, I ordered the company to wake up and line up in an open quadrangle. Then I printed a brown envelope, a Secret Service document of the command. It contained a carefully drafted order for my company to attack across the border. The route and tasks of the day were precisely prescribed. The package contained, in addition, Hitler's proclamation, which I was to read in front of the company. The men listened breathlessly. They furtively looked at each other, but no one said a word. There were still 3 hours left to distribute live ammunition and to give the last combat orders to the platoon commanders and the gun commander moving at the head of the column. There were 3 whole hours, during which people, unsuspecting, slept peacefully at dawn on a Sunday afternoon, and during which the Wehrmacht had moved right up to the border itself, and there the Soviet sentries, tired from the night, were gazing drowsily to the west over treetops. For 3 whole hours, during which millions of German soldiers nervously lit one cigarette after another, covering their fire with the palm of their hand. So 200 divisions finished deploying. Thousands of company commanders received their envelopes. But each order was worded differently and was intended for a very specific unit on a precisely marked piece of terrain. Only the printed proclamations had the same content. We still had 3 hours to go, and for 3 whole hours, goods trains from east to west and from west to east were passing by our fighting positions. The trains coming from the west were carrying consumer goods and cars to the Soviet Union. Trains travelling from the east carried wheat and oil for Germany. The trade agreement was honoured by both sides until the very last minute. Every delay on our part could arouse suspicion. Yet the hands of the clock kept moving. 2 more hours. Another hour. Another 30 minutes. On the other side, in a village near the frontier, the door of the couch creaked and the bins rattled, and somewhere a cock crowed. And again there was the complete silence that only happens in the early hours of a Sunday morning. Now there were only 5 minutes left before the attack began. 4, 3, 2. Sunday, 22 June 1941. 3 hours and 5 minutes. In the air above us roared squadrons of Goering bombers. Over our heads, like a monstrous hurricane, shells of all calibers were howling. They rained down on the sleeping villages, destroyed houses and farm buildings, tore people and animals to pieces. The flames of fires lit up the terrain and that narrow strip through which we were rushing to the east. In some village, a bell rang. A shell had hit the bell tower of a small church, and now the bell was ringing, heralding the coming of Sunday. It was ringing, mourning the murdered abbot and the peasants. This funeral bell ringing accompanied us all 4 years. The first week on Soviet soil. The task of the first day of the war for my company was to advance to the narrow-gauge railway. The task of the war was to destroy everything that we thought was covered by the term Moscow.
We fulfilled the task of the first day, but only on the third day, in the second half of it. The task for the sake of which the war had been started turned out to be unattainable.
No sooner had my company to pass a few hundred meters than it was delayed. The road on which the company was to advance led through a wooded area. The Soviet border guards serving on watchtowers had built shelters for themselves in conveniently located bunkers. The lead first platoon under Lieutenant Steinberg, with 1 gun and 1 machine gun, came under intense rifle and machine gun fire, with which it was met from the shelter. The lieutenant ordered the other gun crews to dismount and try to bypass the firing point, while the lead gun took the border guards under fire. But wherever Steinberg directed his unit, it encountered vigorous resistance. It seemed that the Russians had concentrated a company, if not a whole battalion, in the forest. Apparently, our intelligence was deeply miscalculated. Then I ordered the 2nd platoon to dismount and advance to the right through the forest in a wide arc, while the 3rd platoon made its way to the left through the grove to attack the enemy from the rear. This purely infantry tactic had been used by us many times in exercises of anti-tank units. It succeeded this time, but the attack lasted more than 4 hours. Meanwhile, the road on which the troops were moving was blocked. Behind us accumulated vehicles of the regimental headquarters and 2 other anti-tank companies, a sapper battalion and an artillery unit. We had already had casualties. Lieutenant Steinberg was wounded. 2 machine gunners were killed. Platoon command was taken by squad leader Ballistit, a career field fell from Mecklenburg. The Soviet border guards fired from all barrels. Then there was silence. Undoubtedly, both platoons had outflanked the enemy and forced him to cease resistance. Slowly, from cover to cover, we approached the wood and earth structure, but what we saw there astonished us greatly. The bunker was not a fortified structure at all, but only a primitive shelter made of light tree trunks on which the earth had been piled. The shelter had room for only 8 riflemen. Scattered around the hut were camp flasks, cooking utensils, and many empty cartridges. Behind a small earthen berm lay 3 dead Soviet soldiers. The machine gun they had been firing had disappeared. Their comrades had taken it with them when they ran out of ammunition. Consequently, we were not fighting against a battalion, or a company, or even a full platoon. A small group of border guards delayed us for 4 hours, forced us to turn round and the battery behind us to take up a fighting position, inflicted casualties on us, and then fled. Similar situations were repeated many times during the first day of the campaign, and each time it turned out that it was only a few Red Army men who had encamped in extremely skillfully chosen positions and forced us to take the fight. On the 3rd day, when the 2nd platoon was marching at the head of the column, we came under intense machine gun fire from the flank. It was simply impossible to pass on the road. 2 non-commissioned officers and 3 soldiers were already lying dead between the vehicles. We took cover in the ditches and behind the vehicles and surveyed the terrain with binoculars. Finally, we spotted a machine gun behind a haystack. 4 guns and 8 machine guns opened fire. The bursts were clearly visible, but the Soviet machine gun kept firing. We were delayed for almost 2 hours. Again behind us stood waiting for other large units of the division. Finally, the commander of the 2nd Company put the 2 machine gun crews on motorbikes so that they could drive along the country lane and outflank the enemy. Suddenly we saw 1 soldier run from the stack, picking up a machine gun. Everyone raised their rifles and, standing up, began firing at the fugitive, but he still managed to reach the woods and escape. 1 single soldier paralyzed the action of a large part of the division for 2 hours. For no dead were found at the stack. There were only empty shell casings and a duffel bag. He threw the sack, but not the machine gun.
Thus, constantly delayed by the resistance of individual fighters or groups, we continued our advance towards Dinneberg. The desired respite came only when we had to refuel the vehicles. But where were the Red Army detachments supposedly concentrated near our border?
The infernal heat, the continuous driving, the need to be on the alert all the time and to look round. All this made us extremely tired. We were so exhausted that we tried to sleep without closing our eyes. It didn't work. But at last, after a week of extreme exertion, we lay down, covered with a thick layer of dust, like flour sacks, and slept a dead sleep in the shade of bushes and trees. Reporting back from the infirmary, the voice sounded familiar. I raised myself a little and tried to open my slipping eyelids wide to see for myself that it was indeed Oberleutnant von Voss. In front of me swayed a figure that bore only a remote resemblance to the reserve officer and commander of my first platoon. Egert von Voss was a laid-back Mecklenburger, before his illness very much disposed to eating and drinking well. His trousers and tunic were usually quite tight-fitting. But his fondness for food and drink brought him to kidney disease in Holland, and he had to go to the infirmary. When we moved to East Prussia, he was forced to stay. And now Voss stood before me, thin in a too-wide tunic with sunken cheeks. Egert, my friend, you've become like a scarecrow. Indeed, Oberleutnant, von Voss had lost so much weight that the shins of his boots sagged on his calves. Where have you come from now? I asked him. Yes. When I learnt in the hospital that you had entered Russian territory, I fled. And here I am.
You must have gone mad. Isn't it clear that they sent you a fugitive wanted notice?
I left a note on the bedside table and said I was on my way to my unit. Even so, there's going to be a big scandal. You haven't finished your treatment, have you? Of course not. Don't you realize I couldn't stand it one more day? They won't do anything to me for that. Well, it doesn't matter so much now. But how hard it was to find you here. It was like Odysseus's journey. You were travelling at such a frantic pace that I was already worried whether I could catch up with you closer to Moscow. Tell me, Egert, how did you even get here? Matt, from the German border, it was always by car. And your luggage?
Everything I need is with me, and the rest is in Holland. I'm happy to have found you. Something similar happened to Lieutenant Barkov, commander of the 2nd Platoon, also a reserve officer. Shortly before we entered the Soviet Union, he went into hospital for an appendicitis operation. I still had Lieutenant Steinberg, a cold-blooded careerist. But, as I have already mentioned, he dropped out on the first day, wounded in the knee in a battle for a border bunker.
A day later, Lieutenant Barkov suddenly appeared before me. Only 4 days ago his appendix had been taken out. Not yet removed the stitches after the operation, and he already came to his company. I briefed the platoon commanders on the situation and explained our immediate task, together with a part of the reconnaissance battalion and a platoon of sappers. We as a mixed vanguard were to make our way forward and, dodging the fighting and not paying attention to the flanks, move forward unceasingly to reach the railway junction. There we were to take up a circular defence and cut off the rear communications of the Red Army. It was supposed that in 2 or 3 days the whole division would arrive there. No one thought about the danger of the enterprise and the fact that more than one forward detachment had already been exterminated. We received our task and headed for the machines to fulfill it. Before freeing the guns from the camouflage branches and taking the vehicles out of the forest to the road, we drank. Some of us had a glass of cognac from French trophy stocks, and some of us had vodka, which we had found in the village shop the day before. Everyone was drinking, officers and soldiers, platoon commanders and car drivers. Alcohol gives determination. Before each performance, a portion of strong reconnaissance units, anti-tank and sapper detachments, mortars, guns and transport vehicles, all joined the marching column. The army unit looked like a huge worm that crawled eastwards and gnawed into the foreign land. The sun was scorching mercilessly. We wiped the sweat that covered our eyes with dirty hands. Our faces became monstrous masks. The wheels were bogged down in the sand, reeking of heated clutches, hot oil and melted camouflage paint. We were travelling along a deserted road. Wheat rippling in waves in the fields, red poppies, sunflowers with golden yellow heads, black and white birch trees. Everything around us seemed to recoil in horror as we tore through the silence with a deafening rumble. Behind us a cloud of dust hung in the air. Then it slowly descended, and the bright colours of nature disappeared under a monotonous grey cover.
In front rode Lieutenant Barkov with his platoon. I could rely on him. He orientated himself on the map, on which the names of villages were marked with Russian and German letters, and never lost his way.
I followed him in an open, all-terrain vehicle driven by Hans Bever. He was not only the best driver in the company, not only distinguished by his prowess, but had the so-called sixth sense, as if sensing the danger in the air. Next to him, I could carelessly indulge in my thoughts. So, in my company, there were 2 reserve officers who had been drafted into the active army before the war with Poland began. One of them was a friend of the Muses and liked to spend time in his flat, beautifully furnished, with a tiled bathtub. The other dreamed of draft hunting in the morning fog, dreamed of his potato fields and native places in Mecklenburg. One had rushed to the company from the operating table. The other had left the hospital unauthorized, against all regulations. Both wanted to be with their military unit. If this is the attitude of everyone in our Wehrmacht, then we are doing well. That's what I thought at the time. 2 months later, a wanted order arrived with the remark that Oberleutnant von Voss was to be punished for breach of discipline, and that the punishment was to be reported. We laughed on this occasion and threw the letter into the fire. 2 years later, General von Uprue inspected the infirmaries, where he looked for heroes and threw out half-dead soldiers to the front. Now our affairs were not at all as good as I had previously supposed. But this was determined above all by the substance of the affair itself, and not by the fighting ability of the soldiers. The school burned down. Everyone was convinced that the Soviet Air Force had been put out of action, and along with the Air Force, the Soviet command was deprived of aerial reconnaissance. Our bombers interrupted the main telephone lines, destroyed the communication network. The commanders of the Red Army divisions, whose formations were moving westward to restore the defense front, could not know or even suspect that we were close to close the pincers in their rear. They only noticed it when the supply from the rear stopped, or when the drivers from the supply units reported that they had hardly managed to break through the German troops' position. An hour had passed since we had established contact with the 32nd Division through reconnaissance teams. A company of the Kohlberg Jäger Battalion had settled ahead of us at the edge of the woods. We turned our front to the west and waited for the appearance of the enemy, who would try to move eastwards to escape from the cauldron. But why were we in such a hurry? We were so tired that we were just falling off our feet. Soldiers from the scooter unit hitched themselves to our vehicles to drag them across the sand so they could move at the same pace. As soon as we had a brief respite, the infantry was already on our heels. It was a mystery to us how the infantrymen managed it. But they marched and marched with machine guns on their worn shoulders, holding heavy bulky boxes in their weakening hands. They walked with calluses on their feet, step by step, kilometre by kilometre. They were catching up with us. From the weight of tools, ammunition, flasks and duffel bags, the waist belt slipped sideways, rubbing the blood on the sides. The coarse cloth of trousers tore the skin at the bend of the knee. The sweat-soaked necks were ulcerated from sunburn and fine sand, but the infantrymen were catching up with us. What drove them forward and forward, step by step, kilometre by kilometre? Did it influence them that the division commander General von Seydlitz, passing by the column? Well, soldiers, still tolerable. Just a few kilometres and you are at the target. Perhaps it was important that the regimental commander, Colonel Baron von Lutzow, who was always at the head of the column, encouraged the men. Guys forward, and only forward, and we will cope with them. All this played its part. But there was something else too. We wanted to prove our superiority to the Bolsheviks, and we were eager to get to Moscow. The sooner we reached this goal, the sooner the war would be over and we would finally return home. So we thought. Towards evening, the first Red Army soldiers came out of the forest. The setting sun shone after them. They marched straight towards our positions, not realizing that the ring had already closed. A flare rocket flew up into the sky and burst with the crackle that an air-filled paper bag bursts when struck with the hand. That was the signal for guns, mortars, machine guns and riflemen. The Soviet columns were met with murderous fire. It brought death to their ranks, scattering them in all directions. Then all were swallowed up by the earth. Only corpses remained on the road. Still unkilled horses stood on their haunches in the stiles of overturned ammunition wagons. A little later, a convoy of lorries roared down the road straight towards our positions, past the corpses and horses. For a moment, the lead vehicles stopped, thus slowing down the whole column. Then they rushed forward, because they were already being pressed from the rear by the German units that were tying the sack tighter and tighter. The lorries dashed right and left through ditches and across ploughed fields. 2 or 3 of them, losing control, crashed into trees. One vehicle slowly tilted past side and soldiers fell from the lorry. The high explosive grenades of our guns struck this pile of men. They were mowed down by machine gun bursts and mortar volleys rattled. Petrol tanks exploded with a deafening crack. Flames burst out of the cabs of lorries. Flaming tarpaulins swayed in the wind like red flags. And amidst this horrifying chaos, in this pile of planks and steel bars lay the dead and wounded. A few figures, black as the earth, scattered in different directions. Then they, too, were swallowed up by the earth, as their fellow infantrymen had been earlier. We thought they were all destroyed. But in the last rays of the evening dawn they appeared again, coming at us wave after wave. They ran straight into the oncoming fire, attacked us and shouted their hurrah, in hoarse voices, and they fell, row after row. But even as they fell, they shouted hurrah. Wave after wave, they came closer and closer to our positions. Then several tanks burst out of the forest, followed by infantry under their cover. Our 37mm anti-tank guns sent shell after shell into the frontal armour of the T-34 tanks. Hit after hit, but no holes. Steeply into the sky went a glowing trail of exploded shells. With a wild squeal and buzzing hit ricocheted steel shells in the order of the Soviet infantry and in the trees. That was how we first encountered the T-34. Apparently, its existence was concealed from us when we were told that nothing could resist our 37mm anti-tank guns. In any case, the Soviet tanks broke through our positions and, rattling their tracks, rolled further east. They left behind the dead and wounded, their own and ours. We surrounded them, and they should have all raised their hands. However, in many places they fought their way eastward. That same night, I had to relocate with my company to another dangerous place where our reconnaissance had discovered new Soviet units preparing for a breakthrough. In the clear moonlight, the terrain was clearly visible. Where the road went into the forest, occupied by the enemy, stood a few huts, and just before the forest, where it made a turn, stood a small village school. This building was in our way and had to be removed if we wanted our guns to control the road. Major von Wiedel, commander of the battalion to which my company was attached, tried repeatedly with tracer bullets to set fire to the school, but without success. But it had to disappear, for we had to prevent the enemy from taking up fighting positions behind such cover. And through binoculars we could observe movements near the houses in the moonlight. It became clear to me this school could earn an order. I moved forward with field-fell ballistet, taking with me a machine gun crew, liaisons, a few bottles of petrol and grenades. Our infantry eagerly awaited the outcome of this sortie. First ducking and then crawling, we crept past the huts, from which the voices of the Red Army were heard. At a suitable place we set up a machine gun to provide a barrage. With 2 liaisons, I crawled up to the school itself. It was a school like all the other Soviet village schools I had already looked inside. A simple, sturdy wooden building with several classrooms, furnished with bookcases full of books, with pictures on the walls, with stuffed animals, with Bunsen burners, crucibles and other teaching aids and tools, as well as with textbooks from which the village children learnt German so that they would know who Goethe and Schiller were. At a predetermined signal we jumped up, ran up to the building, threw hand grenades inside through the broken windows. 4 or 5 deafening-sounding bursts in one of the classrooms, then a strong explosion with blindingly bright flames, and the deed was done. We rushed back. Behind us the school was burning. Several people jumped out of the huts. We had to run back past. We opened fire with machine guns and automatic rifles, capturing 3 soldiers who had been taken by surprise and dragged them running towards our forward posts. There we were greeted with loud shouts of approval. Our enterprise had succeeded, we had suffered no casualties, and we had brought back prisoners. And the school was burning along with books and pictures, crucibles and teaching aids, Bunsen burners and desks. The flames of the fire illuminated the small village and the surrounding countryside with such a bright light that no one could move there without the risk of being shot at by our infantry. The prisoners looked round warily. They were 2 soldiers and a lieutenant. We placed the prisoners at my command post, which was set up in a small shed. To take them to the division headquarters, we had to provide 2 or 3 men to accompany them. I tried to interrogate the lieutenant, but nothing came of it. In response to my questions about his unit number and its strength, He only shrugged his shoulders. I involuntarily recalled the Englishman we had captured at Les Basses Canal. I offered him a cigarette, and he took it, thanking me. But it was not to his taste. He fumbled in his pocket, took out a pinch of flypaper, asked us for a scrap of newspaper, rolled a cigarette to his liking, and took a deep drag. That's his culture. He's probably never even seen a real cigarette. My contact shook his head and looked down with a condescending and dismissive chuckle at the Soviet lieutenant, who held his cigarette and pretended not to understand a word. "And this is an officer," added the blonde Ifluter from Hamburg, and at the same time he glanced at Oberleutnant von Voss and at me, waiting for approval. We were uncomfortable with what was happening, for we guessed that the lieutenant understood everything that was being said. We smiled approvingly at him, but he lowered his eyes. "He's thinking about getting away," continued the liaison, and stood at the exit of the shed. "Meanwhile, he should be happy that the war is over for him. Hey, Stalin is kaput, understand?" "Shut up. Don't you see that Ivan is completely exhausted?" Voss reprimanded the Hamburger, who made a resentful face and was clearly upset that he had not been allowed to use the opportunity to enlighten the communist. Glancing askance at the Red Army lieutenant, he stepped back to the back of the barn where the camp radio stood. He turned the lever a little, the sounds of music filled the small room, and we stopped the fruitless interrogation. Outside there was silence, with only the occasional isolated gunshot of a sentry guard. A carbide lamp buzzed under the ceiling. We sat leaning against the wall with our legs stretched out. Little by little, the tension of the recent outing was subsiding. In my mind, I was composing the text of the report to the regiment. Then the contact again raised his voice. "What sad music. It's just awful. There 6 Germans in the barn. Voss, a field officer, a radio operator, 2 liaisons and me. None of us could tell what kind of music it was. I found it good. It just suited the evening mood." Just then a Soviet lieutenant in his corner raised his head and said in German, "Es ist Brandenburg Concerto by Johann Sebastian Bach." Turning to me, he added, "I could, of course, have been mistaken." The announcer's subsequent message showed that he was not mistaken. Brigadier von Voss, coughing, muttered something inaudible to himself and went out. I followed him. As I left, I said to my soldiers, "I'm going to see if the school has burned down." Demian's cauldron, 2 armies of Army Group North during the summer months, occupied the Baltic republics and advanced to Leningrad, Volkhov, and to the shore of Lake Ilmen. One of the corps of the 16th Army under the command of Colonel General Bush, to which our 12th Schwerin Division was attached, went to the Valdai Heights, to the place where the Volga River originates in the primeval forest. Our objective was the Moscow-Leningrad railway line. We had to cut this northern artery of the Soviet Army's rear supply. In the middle of September it rained. From the low-hanging clouds, the downpours poured on the dried-up earth, which greedily absorbed the moisture. But after a few days, the fields and forests were already saturated with moisture, and water stood in the ruts. Roads and paths had turned into swamps, filled with marshy mush. As the infantrymen walked across the fields, turning in a chain, they had to hold their boots by the shins. The vehicles slid and crawled slowly at first speed. Overheated engines stank. Clutches melted and disintegrated. Quite often it happened that the horse-drawn carriages of infantry or artillery overtook our vehicles, and as they passed, the riders grinned gloatingly and remembered the first dry months when we had rushed past them. Every now and then we had to unharness our horses to pull a car or lorry out of the mud with their help. Our division penetrated deep into the Valdai Forests along forest clearings, which were not marked on any maps. The fighting took a new form. The view was limited to a few meters. Death lurked behind every tree and bush. The sudden staccato of a machine gun burst. The echo from all sides that echoed to the shot, and the horrible cries of a wounded man somewhere in the forest thickets made a grievous impression. In a day we had won back a few hundred meters, which cost us more sacrifices than the hundreds of kilometers left behind us. The Red Army stood firm and did not retreat any further. Colonel Baron von Lutzow, who was invariably in front of the column, was wounded in the stomach during the reconnaissance and was carried on a cloak to the medical center. The loss of this commander paralyzed the offensive impulse of the whole regiment. We were stuck, and headquarters had already begun to set up temporary housing in the few villages. Platoons of my company were guarding several forest roads and clearings where Soviet tanks could be expected. We penetrated into the depths of the Soviet country for many hundreds of kilometers. In our rapid forward movement overcame all obstacles, burned countless villages and devastated the fields with ripe crops. Finally, we reached the vast forests and the headwaters of the Volga, and now we are bogged down. Letters from our relatives reached us rarely and with considerable delay. Every now and then a question sounded in the letters, which could be read on the faces of some soldiers. Why all this? The company command set up tents in a small clearing at the crossroads of several forest roads. For 3 days the tents' cloths did not let the moisture from above, and then the water began to seep in large drops through the folds and seams. Even our rubberized cloaks did not protect us from dampness from below. Soaked through, we lay down in the evening and stiffened up in the morning. Our clothes stuck to our bodies and smelled rotten. Our leather clothes were covered with mould. Unaccustomed to prolonged inactivity, we began swearing and drinking. Why the hell aren't we moving forward? Why aren't we getting more reasonable orders at all? On the day I was born, von Vossms dragged me out of the tent by both feet. Outside stood the 3 platoon commanders, the liaison officer, and non-commissioned officer Eric Revolt, who had been transferred to our company as commander of the radio communications section at regimental headquarters. They filled their mugs with old French cognac and organized a real glass for me. Good cognac should be aged, and it should be drunk from beautiful glasses. Cognac from tin dishes is contrary to all good morals. They announced and together with congratulations expressed the hope that I would meet my next birthday in better conditions. Then they sang something and finished with a triple ho. That morning brought another surprise, and not only for me alone. It snowed during the night. Everything turned white. True, after 2 hours the magic disappeared, but the next day it turned white again. Then there was a little snow under the far trees, around the boundary stone and in other places. But one day everything around remained white. Winter had begun. The first order we received at the end of a fortnight was very clear. In accordance with it, we burrowed even deeper into the snow-covered ground. The transition from offensive to positional warfare was in our corps, carried out almost exactly according to the training program. The fact that we had to suspend the offensive was first explained by the conditions of the terrain and the unfavorable effects of the onset of winter in our section. After all, we knew from radio information that on other sections of the Eastern Front, the continuous advance continued and had already succeeded in bypassing Moscow. Only much later we learned that even there, the Red Army not only held firm, but by bold counterattacks forced the armies, corps and divisions of Army Group Center to retreat to a hastily improvised defensive line, and the Wehrmacht lost an immense amount of equipment, countless killed, wounded and captured. We felt the effects of this first major defeat of the Wehrmacht as the enemy pulled up strong shock troops to our positions, probing our defense front to then launch attacks of increasing strength. After the first snowfalls, the frost suddenly struck. It restrained all movement. The sentries in the trenches had to be changed every half an hour. One could not take up arms without mittens, otherwise one's hand would freeze to the iron. There were frequent cases when people froze their feet, hands or face. If the wounded could not be immediately taken out of the line of fire, they died a painful death. Those who had fallen in battle would quickly freeze to death. Corpses mutilated by cramp were stacked like firewood in sheds, as it was impossible to bury them in the ground. Initially we tried to prepare a grave by exploding charges of dynamite, but almost without success. The dead, as well as the living, had to wait for the coming of spring. The survivors hid in bunkers and huts. Only the soldiers who stood outside on watch or performed other service were given half-fur coats and valenki obtained in Russia. Providence sent us to this war when the sun was warming. However, even the old, experienced officers of the General Staff did not care to prepare winter uniforms for millions of German soldiers. They intended to take Moscow in the autumn and put an end to communism. But they did not take the communists into account. Faith in the infallibility of the supreme leadership was replaced by anxiety and gloomy forebodings. But German soldiers fought and froze on ice and in the snow because iron discipline demanded it. They fought without winter uniforms. They died and froze, many with the unspoken question on their lips. The lowest temperature in the Valdai area, as reported in the bulletin of the Artillery Meteorological Post, was 56 degrees below zero. The crows were falling dead to the ground. Now the Soviet counter-offensive had begun on our front as well. North of us, the Shock Army broke the junction between von Kuchler's army and our 16th Army. Our left flank, which also contained the Blue Division from Spain, was far behind. On the night of New Year's Eve, Soviet formations crossed the frozen Lake Ilmen. By that time, its ice cover had become so strong that tanks and lorries could safely pass over it. Our forces were not enough to hold the far-stretching western shore of the lake. The enemy had succeeded in establishing bridgeheads there. A few days later, about 20 Soviet divisions and several tank brigades south of Lake Ilmen launched an attack and made deep breakthroughs. From the initial positions taken in the battles, they turned northwards and made their way forward on both sides of the Lovov River with the clear intention of joining in our rear with the Soviet units that had broken through the north. As this succeeded, the same fate awaited us as had befallen numerous enemy formations during the summer months. During the summer encirclement battles, we believed that we had dealt the Red Army sensitive blows, after which we would have to deal only with miserable remnants. In any case, so said the Wehrmacht reports. Now only in our area these remnants attacked with the strength of more than 20 divisions, and moreover with a completely new and unaccustomed for us impetuosity, and in such cold, when the frost chilled the breath. They attacked, they fought their way through, they joined in our rear, and the Demian cauldrons was closed. But since it could not be recognized that the Soviet troops had succeeded in encircling the German army corps, we were forbidden even to mention anything of the kind in our letters home. At first we were supplied by air, more often badly than well. Far behind us, to the west, lay the true line of German positions, but in our letters home we wrote, "Nothing new here, we feel good." For 14 months, there were 96,000 Germans surrounded. They supported their existence with 1 or 2 slices of bread and a few grams of horse meat a day. Smoked dried crumbs of alcoholic tea from the field kitchen, almost forgot the taste of butter and sausage, and what a potato looks like, were terribly cold, fought at night with few flares, and during the day could not even fire at detected targets. As ammunition was rationed, they languished for hours in constant expectation of a new breakthrough of the enemy, and thus liquidation of the cauldron and capture. But the Wehrmacht reports daily reported only about successful defensive battles in the southeast of Lake Ilmen. In official usage the term Demian Fortress appeared, but in everyday speech we called the Cauldron Brockdorf County after the surname of the general who commanded the corps. Day and night the Air Force on old Junkers 52 transported cargoes for the troops, and returning back transported the wounded and sick. The planes flew in blizzards and in the blinding winter sun, accompanied by fighters and without them, at low altitude, under the frantic fire of anti-aircraft defenses and machine guns. They flew over almost 150 kilometers of strip occupied by the enemy. The pilots looked up at the sky, fearing that the Soviet fighters, invisible because of the blinding glare of the sun's rays, might not crash into the group of transport planes. Most of the heavily laden Junkers were shot down. At the very edge of the cauldron, the enemy built a false aerodrome so similar to the aerodrome in Demiansk that from the air it was difficult to distinguish one from the other. Many of our machines landed there in poor visibility, and they were received by the Red Army. Many aircraft crashed when landing in Demiansk or were destroyed by Soviet bombers while refueling or loading at the parking place. In such conditions, the supply from the air was more than insufficient. We starved all winter. Almost all the horse stock of our division moved to the field kitchens. This advanced bridgehead in the Valdai area would by no means have lasted 14 months, and the remainder of the ambush divisions would never have been evacuated if General Seydlitz had not succeeded in breaking the road to the cauldron from Stara Russa. This narrow artery was constantly under fire, often interrupted for many days, and had to be retaken. But transport columns brought ammunition and food along it. Particularly dangerous to these supply routes were the so-called sewing machines, small single-seat Soviet aircraft with excellent flying qualities. They appeared every night and were rarely shot down. Since they usually sought out their targets on the roads, the soldiers nicknamed them highway sluts. Not only were they generous with shrapnel bombs, but they also dropped leaflets, which were designed as passes and called for crossing the front line. Some were tempted to surrender, to escape the horrors and hardships of war. But a number of other factors were more influential at the time. Fear fueled by Nazi propaganda which suggested that the Bolsheviks would annihilate prisoners by shooting them in the back of the head, the grip of discipline and political beliefs. I will allow myself to say that hardly anyone in our Mecklenburg division took advantage of these passes, at least during the first winter. And whoever dared to take such a step, like the few who had already defected to the Red Army during our offensive, must have been a convinced communist and possessed extraordinary courage. If anyone found himself on the no-man's land between the fronts, he would be fired upon from the front, and, having guessed his intention, from behind as well, until he managed to make a saving leap into the shelter of a Soviet trench. The attacks of the Soviet formations became stronger and stronger. Before each throw we were bombarded by a massive hurricane fire of artillery, such as we had never experienced before. Continuous bursting shells wore down the nerves of the soldiers as they huddled together in shelters, waiting to alert the sentries, who had to stand outside in a hail of steel. The ground was being ploughed over by shells of all calibers. Over the surface of the ground, with a terrible screech and laughter, the fragments whizzed by, destroying, tearing, striking, and killing everything in their line of flight. In this hell, our non-commissioned medical officer, Willie Fisher of Hagen, in Westphalia, and his men treated their wounded comrades with amazing dedication. When we asked how things were outside, the non-commissioned officer replied with stoic equanimity, air with a strong admixture of iron. In this deadly whirlwind, non-commissioned officer Eric Revolt of Bad Souls used his wire hauler to pull and mend broken telephone wires and re-establish communication with headquarters. Panting and despite the bitter cold, drenched in sweat, he returned back to the bunker, but when asked how things were outside, he answered indifferent. Everything is in order. Later he was promoted to officer. But in this hell, one soldier's nerves changed. He shot himself in the foot, threw a scrap of bread in order to return to his homeland. Still, the scrap of bread was not thick enough to leave the gunpowder fouling unnoticed. Self-mutilation was established, and a court-martial sentenced him to death. The punishment did not frighten everyone, because many felt it was an even greater punishment to be condemned to stay in that hell, only to die in the end. Incidents of self-mutilation began to increase in frequency. When the enemy stopped attacking, company commanders would sit down by the light of a smouldering lamp to write letters to the wives and mothers of those who had fallen in battle. Although we often witnessed the hours-long death throes of a dying comrade and could not help him, we wrote consoling phrases in hundreds of letters. He died at once and did not suffer. He gave his life for the Führer, the people and the fatherland, and yet the dying man called for his mother, wife and children. We sent home the things left by the dead. Personal insignia were broken in half. One half was sent to the division when reporting casualties. The other half remained with the killed man. From the front, the reports were forwarded to the reserve army. People were written off. The younger generation became a replenishment for the front, but did not compensate for the loss of husbands, fathers, and brothers. A man became a material part of the military mechanism. There were letters and parcels from Germany. There were letters full of optimism, whether because the writer believed in the just cause, or because he was afraid of censorship and possible consequences. There were letters from which a soldier at the front learned that his family had been killed in a bombing raid and, consequently, his loved ones, for whose defense he had fought, no longer existed. At the same time, I had to sleep, if only to maintain discipline and my authority. So I continued to lie there with my eyes closed and heard nothing. Besides, I still believed Hitler and believed in his victory. True, I had just before written a letter to a young soldier's widow. Fischer came from the front line, and I could understand his indignation. Besides, I considered him a National Socialist too, and I was sure that the next day he would have a different opinion of his own words, which came out of his mouth when he was not in control of himself. For a few days I was troubled by the unpleasant thought that one of the witnesses to the incident might not have been vigilant. Then I forgot about it, after 14 months of heavy fighting and stubborn defence, which cost great sacrifices. The Demian bridgehead was finally surrendered. It was impossible to hold it. There remained empty bunkers and abandoned trenches, wagons for which there were no horses, lorries and motorbikes for which neither spare parts nor fuel could be obtained, millions of empty shell casings and machine gun belts, and those who had fallen in battle, over whose graves the same question invisibly hovered. Why? The Wehrmacht bulletin said that the front had been straightened according to the command's plans. That's all. Satisfactory supply of troops caught in the cauldron was impossible. This was realized by every soldier. Marshal Hermann Göring should have consulted with some ordinary infantryman before, shortly after Demiansk, to give a guarantee that will ensure the supply of more than 300,000 people in the Stalingrad cauldron. Soldiers who had been on the Eastern Front that winter received a medal. It was called the Order for Frostbitten Meat, and he who fought in Count Brockdorff-Ehlefeld's corps and got surrounded received 2 years later. If he survived, the right to sew to the sleeve of a French coat Demian chevron established by the Führer. In the reserve army. I hardly heard the sound of the explosion, but the huge fountain of dirt that showered me with shrapnel, sand and stones haunted my nightmares for a long time. My wounds, or rather bruises, were quite harmless. The lingering inflammation of my frontal sinus, which had started in the winter, gave me much more trouble. The doctor prescribed treatment in a hospital back home. I left Demiansk in a transport car. The arriving planes delivered now, in spring, winter uniforms, which in Germany had been collected for the front. Ladies' coats and knitted jumpers, pullovers for skiing and coloured shawls, furry hats and fur muffs from my grandmother's old chest. So thoughtful was the Führer's appeal, and the homeland collected donations. Now the sun was shining and Soviet fighters were circling in the air, waiting for the clumsy Junkers. But we landed safely in Riga. Only on the next day I could fly to Berlin on a leave certificate, where I had to report to the Charite Clinic for an examination. I saw Riga as far as possible in a few hours. In the evening I went to one of the officers' clubs. My grey boots, which had not been cleaned for many months, had long since lost their shine. The leather on my trousers was cracked, and there were 2 patches on my knees. My French coat was sun-faded, frayed at the elbows, and the buttonholes were frayed. Only the 2 gold stars were new, a testament to the fact that they were still worn by a young captain. I was made a few days ago, 1 May 1942. The cap was faded, the leather visor was bent, and the cord was black rather than silver. The Ober-Efreier at the entrance to the casino looked me over from head to toe with indignation, as one might look at a man who would appear at the opera tonight in a tracksuit. I paid no attention to him and passed him into the dining room, where the officers were seated at tables, alone and with ladies. There I chose a suitable seat, and then noticed that those present were seeing me off with glances and whispering. At last I seated myself and looked round. None of the assembled gentlemen were wearing boots. They were wearing long trousers, silver tunics, and dazzlingly fresh underwear. They showed off their cufflinks, twirled crystal wine glasses between their groomed fingers, drank with a slight bow to the health of the ladies, beckoned to the orderlies, and ordered a multi-course dinner. I sat alone at my table, studied the menu, in which neither Ommete aux confitures nor French champagne were omitted, and suddenly felt homesick for my company. It was clear that these gentlemen, mostly intendants and clerks, as well as a few elderly officers with First World War insignia, had not smelt the front. I left the officers' club and went to the soldiers' hostel at the railway station. There were no ordinaries and no white tablecloths on the tables. The air was such that one could hang up an axe, and to find a free chair anywhere near a table one had to climb over mountains of luggage. Soldiers coming from the cauldron had only a small bag with them. From other parts of the front they carried large luggage, and some bags had a goose head or neck sticking out of them. Furloughed soldiers from the rear areas had many tied bags. In the soldiers' dormitory they drank bad beer and cheap vodka, ate sausages and cutlets that were more the product of the baker than the butcher. There was a cheerful noise. The scat players were loudly banging their cards on the table. There was swearing and laughter. The soldiers at the table took no notice of me. They sat down just before I came in, took the cigarettes I had blown round with the words, "Thank you very much, Mr. Captain," and then went about their business again. I leaned my head against the wall and fell asleep under not very comfortable conditions, in the stuffiness and noise. But I slept well and was content. I was awakened only by the deafening shout of the gendarmes announcing the departure of the train with the holiday makers. I was travelling in a first-class compartment with an elderly colonel who was asking me in great detail about the cauldron in Demiansk. He had already heard something about it at the commandant's office. At the old Reich frontier, we had to pass through an extermination station, including the elderly colonel, who was very unhappy that no one outside his commandant's office considered the lice-free certificate he had issued to himself to be valid. He was forced, like the others, to strip naked, hang up his clothes on an iron crucifix and hand them in at a window, then stand under a shower, then let himself be anointed with disinfectant solution from a bucket, then stand under a shower again, and then, half wet, go to the window to receive his clothes, still hot from the disinfection frying, and finally put them on. There was no trace left of the ironed crease in his trousers, and his handsome new French coat was completely rumpled. But the colonel, like the rest of us, received a certificate that he had been sanitized. We had to present this document at the next window in order to be given the Führer's parcel. The food contained in it could be used to bake a cake for the whole family at home. The parcel also contained coffee, chocolate and cigarettes, delicacies from various countries, trophy property, stolen goods. But the Führer's parcel sounded better, and besides, the holiday-makers did not return home empty-handed. The Führer had taken care of everything. I arrived in Berlin just in time to be at my sick mother's bedside in her last moments. My sister and brothers also came to the funeral. My sister came from Holland, where, thanks to her knowledge of languages, she had worked in German purchasing organizations. Our eldest crown prince, Brother Willie, came from Krakow, where he was designing new hub stations in the Technical Bureau of the Reich Railway Administration, and Erich came from Oslo, where he had been ordered by Goebbels to convince the Norwegians of their belonging to the Nordic race and of the rightness of our grandfather. Father kept his place in Berlin. He went to work. From work he went to the underground shelter. From there he went to work again, and in between he cursed Hitler. He did the same with me. During the air raid we went to the shelter, and when a bomb exploded nearby, he began to curse Hitler. Then, looking at me, attacked the British. Our neighbours in the house first looked at me with fright, then in anticipation turned their eyes to me, and when the old man began to berate the British, the others pretended as if nothing had happened. I pushed my father with a meaning look, but he only remarked, "Leave it. Everyone here is an Englishman." If we went to the pub together, he showed me off to his acquaintances, making no secret of the fact that he was very proud of his youngest son, Mr. Captain. The first night bomber raid on Berlin, which took place in my presence, was followed by others. Every morning the streets looked different. Where yesterday there were still towering houses, today there were smoking ruins, mass graves of people buried beneath them. Almost every night there was an alarm. It was hard for me to stay in the shelter for long. I could no longer look at the trembling women, hear the cries of the children. The heaviest battles at the front made a less terrible impression on me than this roaring, shrieking, rumbling, crackling in the red-hot hell of the narrow neighbourhoods, this deadly fear of a crowd of unarmed men under the command of some Nazi party representative on duty, with a bellicose helmet on his head and a ridiculous lighter spatula in his hand, as if he were on a campaign against flies. I was glad to be rid of these impressions that could drive me mad. An examination at the Charite Clinic ended with me being sent for an operation at the infirmary in Coburg. After my recovery, I went to the Manning Department to receive my new assignment. I hoped that, according to my rank and length of service, I would become a battalion commander. The Manning Department was headed by a reserve lieutenant colonel. Company commanders were also reservists. The chief was pleased that at last he'd got a regular officer, who understood the business a little better than the gentlemen who had moved here from their big estates, and who also came from the Eastern Front. It was important for him to keep me in his unit, and he had the opportunity to do so for at least 9 months, according to the instructions in force. He hoped that he would soon be promoted to colonel. A successful review of his recruits, noticed upstairs, might hasten the coveted promotion. It is not surprising that my application for sending to the front was rejected. And instead of a battalion, I received a company and a commission to teach it to keep equal to the guide, because, in the opinion of the chief, it was completely decayed. Meanwhile, my predecessor disbanded the company. Captain von Puttkamer was the same chief, was presented for promotion, and already shone at the headquarters in the rank of major. This familiarity was disgusting to me. Many things I did not like. As soon as an officer in full uniform appeared in a restaurant, he was invited to the club room, where the Nazi bigwigs were already seated, ostensibly gathered for an important meeting. In reality, viands were served there which ordinary mortals could not get in the common rooms. I took part in it. I had neither the stamina nor the intelligence to refuse, but nevertheless I was disgusted. I simply could not see the exempted, supposedly indispensable representatives of power from the party authorities in their brown uniforms and with a revolver in their holsters. The regular Führer of the Hitler Youth, who, together with his friend from the German Girls' Union, walked the streets, also disgusted me, and I told him so when I met him, when he asked me if I knew that I was obliged to salute him. He reported this incident to the Imperial Command of the Hitler Youth Union. From there, after wandering around for months, the report went to my new division, and there to the rubbish bin. In the German troops at Leningrad, there was no time to worry about the application of the Führer's order on the order of exchange of greetings between the ranks of the party apparatus and the Wehrmacht. I was deeply unhappy with the atmosphere in which I found myself at home. I could not stand little Hitlers, but like thousands of other Germans, consoled myself with the formula. If the Führer knew it. In the officers' clubs, the old style was retained, but now the tone was set by reserve officers. There was plenty of champagne and cognac from France in the cellars, so that they could celebrate victories at the front and drown in wine the anxiety over the straightening of the front that had become necessary, or the anxiety over America's entry into the war. Late in the evening, when the law-abiding officers close to the Nazi party, or their replacements from the Hitler Youth were no longer at the table, they, tipsy, retold anecdotes in a slightly slurred tongue, and, laughing, teased the F-later. The witticisms about Hitler, Göring or Goebbels, were good, but they were repeated by the very persons who, the next day, were promoted by the Führer's favour. All this was not to my liking. In the autumn of 1942, a scandal broke out. The weather was lovely. The late autumn sun was warming. Nevertheless, the commander ordered that all participants in the review, officers and soldiers, should wear macintoshes throughout the day. No amount of pleading to point out that the exercise would go much better in such good weather if the macintoshes remained in the wardrobes did not help. The chief insisted on conducting the drill in macintoshes. There were 3 front-line officers and over 10 reserve officers serving in the manning department. The 3 of us knew why the other officers supported the commander. My unit had done well at the review, and the general talked to me longer than the other commanders. I couldn't help myself and started a conversation about the cloaks. Mr. General, the review would have gone even better if the companies had gone out without cloaks. Well, why didn't you? Unfortunately, I wasn't ordered to, Herr General. I don't understand. There are a number of officers and non-commissioned officers here who haven't been to the front. When they're wearing their coats, no one notices they don't have any insignia. It disgusts me to see all this, Herr General. So everything finally fell into place. The corps commander from Stettin took my outpouring of emotion calmly. My superior, who was standing there with a crimson face, reacted differently. The general even cheered up. This gave me courage, and I asked if he would not agree to facilitate my return to the front. It cannot be said that I was so eager to go to the front. I had suffered enough there. But it seemed to me that being at the front was a more honourable thing to do than these occupations in the reserve army. Here the chiefs made me go through that deadening barracks drudgery, which they themselves could barely overcome in peacetime. Military service was restricted by instructions, squeezed into the narrow framework of outdated ideas, frozen in old forms. As a result, a senior EFRI man with many years' service, wounded at the front, had to exercise again in formation or in saluting. instead of being given the opportunity to teach new recruits how, with or without the help of a shovel, to be able to dig a better trench with lightning speed. At this very time, the Red Army was conscripting recruits, equipping them, and training them in the field. As a result of improper training, the Wehrmacht recruits arrived at the front with such naive ideas that we would not be surprised if these young soldiers noted the lack of central heating and comfortable toilets in the bunkers. In the first weeks, they had to work hard to shed the excessive ballast with which they were burdened. In general, the preparation for the front was in many respects so unsatisfactory that it had to be made up for already on the front line between battles. I believed that it was urgently necessary to change a lot of things in this matter. However, I realized that independent attempts to do anything were doomed to failure. That is why I was eager to go to the front again. One might say that I was choosing the lesser evil, as Lieutenant Barkov and Oberleutnant von Voss had once done when they deserted from the hospital. And many other officers later told me that they had similar sentiments. Now, more and more soldiers were going to the front who were fed up with the Brown denunciation, the Nazi chatter about exploits, the corrupted propaganda, and the usually falsified newsreels. It was, according to my understanding at the time, a flight forwards. At that time, I was still under the illusion that with more correct training, with less negligence in the reserve army, and with such training of recruits, which really corresponds to the front requirements, our fighting ability will be significantly increased, and we will achieve great successes. I was then infinitely far from realizing that this war was doomed to defeat from the outset already by virtue of its immense aggressiveness and boundless inhumanity. A better functioning of the army mechanism would only have prolonged the unjust war, and it would have cost even greater casualties for a number of years. Such contact with organizational malfunctions, with moral turpitude and other outrages only encouraged me to compose a new version of the tried and tested legend of the dagger in the back, and I indulged in the noble struggle with even greater fervor. It was not until much later that I realized that the very principles, the very meaning of the war had to be questioned. The general was sympathetic to my request, but by no means my superior, a lieutenant colonel in the reserve. I before the general challenged his measures and bypassed the usual official route and asked directly to the corps commander for my transfer. This was sufficient grounds for punishing me the very next day in full form with 2 weeks as house arrest. When I thereupon reported for duty again, an order had already been received for my use as commander of an anti-tank division. The 23rd Division had been defeated and had to be restaffed with both old cadres and young recruits. The manning location for my unit was Kohlberg. As a division commander, I now moved into the room next to that of the lieutenant colonel who had disciplined me a fortnight before. Despite the same rank, there was a significant difference between us. He was the head of the manning department, while I was assigned to form a unit of the active army. I had the right to demand equipment from him, to select regular soldiers and recruits, to challenge his measures, to reject what he offered me. I drove him mad because I knew the rules better than he did. It was worth the fortnight's house arrest for that alone. In almost a fortnight, I had 3 companies and a staff. For further training, we were transferred to the Oksbøl training ground in Denmark, where other units of the 23rd Infantry Division were assembled